Today we're going to talk about some of the things that are in motion, apparently, in the Chinese system. Now, for those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that I am not very bullish on China. It's facing not demographic collapse, it's far faster than that, just complete demographic dissolution and economic collapse that goes along with that within the decade, assuming that there are no other problems. The United States has put in a series of technological restrictions that basically kill the entire tech sector. Their energy sector is completely dependent upon the ability to access the Middle East, which is an area they can't reach in force. Their trade system and their economic structures and their employment structures are utterly dependent upon the U.S. Navy making it safe for their civilian vessels to hit the world over. They are arguably the most internationally exposed country in the world, and on top of that, their financial sector and their agricultural sectors are absolute messes, things that make Enron look really well run. This is a country that is not going to last a whole lot longer. And in that environment, the question is, how do the Chinese prepare for the economic and if they want to politically continue? To this point, their solution has been absolutely rabid, foaming at the mouth nationalism, convincing their people that it doesn't matter if you can feed your kids, it doesn't matter if you have your job, you're Han Chinese and Chairman Xi is your leader, and that's enough. And to that end, Chinese propaganda has gone from the aggressive to the absolutely hateful. The person who has probably played the biggest role from an international point of view in this is a guy by the name of Zeihan, who has been the spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he is kind of the poster child for what the Chinese call warrior wolf diplomacy, which is an unapologetic, ultra-nationalist, very hate and invective-filled approach to dealing with the rest of the world. So this is the guy who has popularized art that shows Australian soldiers with their knees on third world children. This is the guy who insists that COVID started at Fort Detrick in the United States and was then spread to the world as a way to wipe out non-white people, that sort of thing. He's a real piece of work, and he's a general asshat. Anyway, as long as he was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he was the voice of China on the international stage. Well, in the first week of January, he was transferred very quietly away from the MFA, and he is now a small wig at the Department of Ocean and Boundary Affairs, which is about like getting taken from being the spokesman of God, and all of a sudden now you're responsible for, what would be a great example here? You're in charge of Border Patrol in northern Idaho. It's difficult to imagine someone falling so far so fast. Now, the challenge we have in interpreting this is that no one really knows what Xi is thinking, because Xi is in such a tight cult of personality that he doesn't really confide in anyone, and it's very difficult for intel to penetrate that sort of environment. But we know that Zhao was one of Xi's favorites. And so for Xi to be not just demoted, but put into a complete cubbyhole in the middle of nowhere in terms of bureaucracy is an indication that Xi knows that this strategy has utterly failed. There is no version of China that survives this unless it finds a way to work with the United States in a constructive way, and one that basically gives the United States everything from a strategic point of view that it wants. The United States is the only country that even theoretically has the tools that could help China survive what's coming. And having somebody whose job it is to throw gravel into the gears of the diplomatic relationship obviously is not helping at all. But to have him so dramatically demoted indicates that perhaps, just maybe, kind of, sorta, Xi is realizing that the end is approaching, and he really needs to change diplomatic gears if there's any hope for China surviving the rest of this decade. So it's very perspective at this point. But if there was one person who needed to move in order to make a new approach happen, it was Zhao, and now he's gone.
And China is now the fastest collapsing demographic in human history. And there is no way the PRC survives the next decade in its current form. They just don't have the tax structure and the labor structure to even try. So this was always going to fail this decade. COVID may be speeding things up a little bit. And the end of China as kind of a major centerweight in the East Asian geopolitical structure, that is something that is going to reverberate for decades to come. Now, from the American point of view, this is all a net gain. From the Japanese point of view, this is all a net gain. But for some of the countries that were trying to have their foot in both worlds, have their cake and eat it too, this is a bit of a disaster. So if you are Korea or say Thailand or maybe even India, where you've tried to balance your security needs with the United States, your economic needs with the Chinese, you're about to lose both because the Americans are no longer interested in patrolling the world and they're resourcing their entire manufacturing system. That doesn't leave a lot else for anyone else. Demographically, they're in collapse. There's no way we can rework that. The Chinese are releasing bits of their 2020 census now, and they're grudgingly admitting that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million, all of whom would have been born since one child, and most of whom would have been women. So even with like some low-level cloning, China's not going to survive this decade. They don't even have the numbers to try. Second, the Chinese have a lot of ships, but most are very small, and almost all of them can't sail more than 1,000 miles from port, and only that if they're moving slow and not dodging and no one's shooting at them. So the Chinese don't have the naval capacity to go out and secure markets or resources. They are entirely dependent on the U.S. Navy to do that for them. And to think that a core tenet of the U.S. national policy in this era is to bleed and die so that the Chinese can import raw materials and export finished goods, that strikes me as a stretch. Third, they've lost their government. I think one of the biggest problems they're having right now is the chairman himself, Xi Jinping. He's enacted a cult of personality that is tighter than anything that has ever existed through Chinese history, and it's gotten so tight that no one wants to bring him information about anything, and no one wants to do anything if they think it's going to clash with what he wants. So we have this policy paralysis throughout the entire Chinese system. They are now incapable of changing. I think the best example I can give you is that in Shanghai, they are now literally disinfecting runways at the airport because of COVID fears. There's just no functional policy coming down from the top, because when you only have one dude, can you imagine if you're in a Fortune 500 company and the CEO had to direct every specific thing, him or herself? Now, that for a country of 1.4 billion people, 1.3 billion people. Everything is seizing up. They're not making progress on transport. They're not making transport in the information or the digital economy. They're bringing down their own stock market because they've turned everything into cult of personality economics. This is how countries die. And Xi has really done everything he could to purge the system of all potential rivals. And that has included intimidating into silence or imprisoning anyone who is capable of independent thought within the bureaucratic system. So you never want to rule out something like a coup. It could happen, but if that did happen, it's difficult to see whoever would pull it off to be able then to control the country on the other side of it. They might be a regional leader and they might be fine for their region, but the rest of the Chinese system would have a different opinion on who should be in charge. That's how civil wars begin. So I don't think that's a great thing to put your hopes into if you're hoping for China to remain part of the international system. In the case of Russia, it's not quite so tight, which is not to say that it's not tight. There's probably 6 people remaining that have access to Putin on a regular basis, 3 of whom are toadies and who are incompetent. That's like the defense minister Shoigu or Medvedev, the former president. And then there's 3 people who are actually intelligent, like Patrushev, who ran the KGB for the longest time, or FSB now, or Igor Sechin, who's in charge of the state oil concern. But of everyone within the Russian elite, the only one who might have the guts to actually off Putin is Igor Sechin himself. But if there's one thing everyone else in Russia agrees upon, it's that Igor Sechin is kind of a prick, and they would all kill him if he actually tried. So there's not a lot of hope in terms of Kremlin watching or Forbidden City watching in terms of what might be a